The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 2, Chapter 921, No Easy Prey. The suit of armor struggled with all its might, but the grip Lex had around its arms and torso did not let it muster much strength. It used various techniques, but since they were mostly fire-based, they did nothing to Lex. Lex had not figured out how the suit of armor made a clone and disappeared despite the fact that it had repeated the move a few times already, but Lex had figured out that as long as they were touching, the technique wouldn't work. So despite all its effort and resistance, it turned out to be nothing more than its dying throes, or it would have been if Lex continued to use the technique the entire time. Space warp was extremely expensive in terms of energy consumption, and he could not keep it active for more than a couple of seconds. So, after using it for exactly half a second, Lex stopped. His main objective was not to defeat the armor like this, but only to severely injure it, which he did. Blood squirted out of the numerous holes that had appeared in Lex's body, but none of them seemed to weaken him. The armor, on the other hand, was in a much worse condition than Lex. After all, Lex had made sure that the armor bore the brunt of the strange ash that space broke down into. Weakened, but not defeated, the armor looked at him as it seemed to be preparing a counterattack. But Lex had no intention of giving it such an opportunity. He summoned his second ceremonial divine item, his self-made butter knife. Although the weapon was not too sharp or powerful, as of yet, it was at least durable. Since his hands were behind the armor, as he still gripped it in a bear hug, he stabbed the knife in its back after coating it in his intent, which seemed to work. With the integrity of the armor already compromised, one big slash was all it took to cut the entire backplate of the armor. That is not how it works. I do not have the authority to use training dummies in this matter. Any and all damage I inflict using the dummies, I also have to heal. Besides, if I summon any suits of armor strong enough to defeat the deity, it will sense the danger and escape. Approaching it stealthily is the only option. Well, you don't need to worry about him running away even if he does sense me, Lex said reassuringly. We have an old grudge to settle. I doubt he'll miss the chance to get his revenge. Hurry now, and remember what I've taught you. Damage the core of the clone as quickly as possible. Since this is not its true body, there will be some ceremonial item inside its body which can sustain its divinity. I know, said Lex and leaned forward on the pup, so that their bodies were close together. This is going to be a big hunt. Do your best, he said to Fenrir, even as he mentally prepared himself. The reason he took a new sword, despite the fact that it was normal length and not 8 feet long, was that it was sharper and deadlier than the one he was using previously. He did not want to give up a single advantage. The pup, well aware that their quarry was no easy prey, began to use its various techniques to hide them. He removed their presence, washed away all of Lex's smell, eliminated their energy signatures, and did his absolute best to blend it. It was impossible to completely take a deity by surprise, as divinity literally was of the min energies responsible for divination and future sight. But that also did not mean that deities were all-knowing. They would try to get as close as possible before they were detected. Sometimes, even if one saw the future coming, they could not avoid it. Chapter 922, Corruption. A baby riding a wolf pup stealthily made their way through the temple halls, following directions given by Cassandra's projection before she vanished. Even as a projection, she could not follow them, as projections contained some traces of energy which might be detected. The carpeted, fragrant rooms they traversed through contained diluted traces of energy reminiscent of the one they experienced at the previous level, which allowed Lex to heal further. Although he had only used space warp for half a second, it had severely depleted his energy reserves. Fortunately, as they made their way to RA, those reserves returned to full. But, similarly, RA would also be much more powerful now, as he had spent months on this level already. Lex thought back to their last exchange. At that time, stating that he was an atheist felt really cool, but he was sure that he would pay up for trying to look cool now. But even so, Lex never doubted his ability to win. Now that he himself could potentially be targeted by the temple's enemies should the temple be revealed, He was even willing to pull out desperate measures, such as the immortal-level bombs he had in his spatial bangle. But, more than likely, his butter knife would be more beneficial in this fight. Despite its short time existing, divine weapons were uniquely suited to be used against deities and races that relied on divine energy. He steadied his breathing and narrowed his eyes as they neared Ra. Even before Lex could see him, he could sense him. The deity was not restraining his aura at all, and so its divine pressure was spread throughout the many rooms that surrounded it. Maybe it was a way of keeping away enemies, as not everyone could ignore the pressure as easily as Lex and Fenrir. Maybe he was just too focused on restoring himself to worry about such things. His instincts also began to act up. They were not warning of the grave danger ahead, as one would expect. Instead, they were blaring as loudly as they could that Lex needed to go handle business with Ra before it was too late. Oddly, that was reassuring. As Lex and Fenrir neared the once great Ra, Lex could hear an insidious voice grunting and grumbling in his mind. It was as if, in close proximity, the energy from Ra's body acted akin to spirit sense. That wasn't good, but fortunately, the deity was too focused on whatever he was doing to notice them. Lex heard words, but even his universal translator failed to translate them. Or perhaps they meant nothing at all. He recognized Ra's voice, though, as well as the copious amount of fury packed into the voice. The closer they stepped to the deity, the more strange things began to happen. It started to become darker, and the air smelled like the sensation of nausea. Lex felt something brush past his body, but he resisted it. A curse. He knew what it was instinctive, but it could not latch onto him. Fenrir, too, seemed immune, though he was vibrating more and more. Lex did not summon his sword yet, as the threat of a weapon could alert Ra, but he set his eyes on the deity's body. Their plan was set. They were already much closer than they had initially expected. Fenrir took one more step, and both of them saw an unnatural tremble pass through the deity's body. He had sensed them at last. But it was too late. Fenrir, having long suppressed the revulsion it felt deep in its bones, suppressed himself no longer and leaped at the battered body, his teeth digging deep into its neck. Lex's tiny body had also leaped forward, the butter knife appearing in his hand, and plunged it into Ra's chest where his heart should have been. He was aiming to stab the core of Ra's body, the ceremonial item buried within this vessel. But instead of the ceremonial item, he found a distinct lack of anything. It was as if his hand had punctured into an empty shell. "I have been waiting for you," roared a broken, grating voice as Ra's body crumpled to the ground, clearly a distraction. Chapter 923 Ruler of Heaven vs. Invincible Tyrant. "Surprise, surprise," said Lex, his voice tinged with sarcasm as he watched the broken and battered body on the floor. A trap. Who could have seen that coming? Everything about Lex, from his posture, to his tone of voice, and his words spoke of the fact that he was displaying a very cavalier attitude as if he did not take his current situation as a threat at all. The truth was the exact opposite. Lex had, in fact, spread out all his spirit and soul since the moment he felt something odd about Ra's body. But while he heard Ra screaming, he could not detect the deity. Unless he found Ra, there was nothing he could do to him. So, the best solution he had was to bait him. The two of them already had animosity, and based on his experience, Lex judged that Ra was either not in his best state mentally, or he was just a very careless deity. Either way, aggravating him was the best way of luring him out. "Things are different now, vermin. You will not catch me unprepared again. I control the cycle of life and death. You will suffer for eternity." "An eternity of torture is much preferred to hearing you moan," Lex said, surveying his surroundings. Even his left eye was active, yet he could not locate him. Pathetic worm, kneel. The nauseating, corrupt aura that had been emanating from Ra's body crashed down on Lex. Lex was almost amused. Was Ra trying to use aura to pressure him? "That's cute," Lex said, smirking. "I bet you're pretty mad, huh, Ra?" Lex said, gathering his own aura as he prepared for the upcoming fight. "Guess what? Half the reason I put up with so much stuff for so long is because I'm not completely satisfied either. For plotting against the inn, how could I let you off so easily? Even though currently Lex was only a foot large, the pressure he was giving off was nothing short of gargantuan. Notorious anonymity covered his face and domination spread out across the floor. Lex did not leap forward. He did not run or charge either. Step by step, he began to approach RA, his momentum rising as he approached. Behind him a vague image appeared momentarily, but it dispersed too quickly and no one could tell what it was. But no one was looking behind him to begin with. Short though he might be, the bloodlust Lex was giving off was not little. He had been biding and suppressing his remaining anger in his mind for too long. Now, he finally let it all out. Kill him, RA commanded, undeterred by the display. As a deity, what kind of warrior had he not already seen? In his long life, Lex would not even be worthy of being remembered. The corrupted creatures and suits of armor charged forth, spreading their corruption like a tumor. RA did not know what this place was, though he felt like he should. It was almost as if the memory of this place had been forcibly stripped from his mind. But no matter, he had recovered tremendously, and regained some of his authorities. With the authority of creation at his disposal, what did he have to fear? His minions finally reached Lex, but a single swipe of his intent-covered sword was enough to push them back. The fight between RA, the ruler of heavens and the bringer of light, and the invincible tyrant had begun. Suddenly, RA's figure felt teeth sink into its neck, and a wolf pup appeared out of nowhere. Chapter 924 Knowledge is Power. Whether it was the corrupted armors or beasts, none of them were weak. With the sharpness of his blade accompanied by the strength behind it, not to mention sword intent, it should have easily sliced through them if they were ordinary, but it did not. If there was one saving grace to being assaulted from all sides by powerful foes, it was that the diminished space prevented them from dodging and blocking his attacks effectively. Inferno Blade, Clean Sweep. Inferno Blade, Judgment. Those were the two close combat attacks from the Inferno Blade technique, Clean Sweep designed to hit many enemies and Judgment designed to overwhelm a single one. Transitioning between various moves from the same technique would gradually raise the attack power of each move. Moreover, it was easy to transition between moves from the same technique. So Lex began to exclusively use these two moves, not bothering with the long-range one. The entire blade turned molten red after a few moves, but that did not compromise the integrity of the blade, it just made it more lethal. Those that had been able to survive his first attacks were now being burnt and cut through at the same time. One of the feathery creatures attacked from above, its hands containing a black ball of living flesh, still thumbing. Lex would naturally not miss it, and his blade did not hesitate to deliver judgment. The creature died, and Lex did not hesitate to transition into Clean Sweep to cut off a couple of armors closing in, but the black flesh exploded under the attack. Parts of it were seared, but nonetheless a revolting goo splashed the entire area. Yet, somehow, not a speck fell on Lex. He naturally did not miss the flesh when he attacked, and by now Lex had thoroughly learnt his lesson. He took no enemy lightly, and no situation too easily. Earlier, he thought he had RA contained, but the entire planet ruptured through space itself, preventing him from finishing him off. If back then Lex had killed him, he would not be in this situation. RA was experiencing what Cassandra called a fall from grace, but that didn't matter right now. Lex had barely used any effort at all, yet the entire tide of minions was immobilized. The few dozen he slayed personally lay in broken, burned and melted pieces around him, while the rest fell to the ground and began to writhe under the purifying light coming from his array. Knowing the enemy's weakness made such a massive difference. If Lex had not studied, he would have relied on his lightning tribulation arrays, as he always did. He ignored the cannon fodder and looked towards RA. Its body was more easily visible now, so it was much easier to tell it had been corrupted. Its once graceful feathers had been shed, and replaced by sickly flesh and jagged bones. But that did not make it look weaker, no. Falling from grace only made the fallen stronger. After all, some considered this the true manifestation of divinity. Nonetheless, even with its newfound power, Ra was nowhere near his peak. On top of that, his existence aggravated Fenrir in a way Lex had never seen before. The result was a massive Fenrir, returned to its original size, fighting barbarically against the avian deity. Fenrir took a lot more damage than Ra, but that did not mean Ra was uninjured. For whatever reason, Fenrir's claws were especially potent against Ra. Unhurried, Lex stepped forward, dragging the flaming sword on the ground behind him, his left eye forever focused on Ra, searching for a weakness. With his left hand now free, he began to draw another array. Simple tricks such as a purifying light wouldn't work on a full-fledged deity, so Lex would have to be more creative. Chapter 925 Throne. There was a reason Ra was so confident this time around, even if Lex couldn't see it yet. With his left eye, he observed the fallen deity, and though he discovered certain weaknesses, most were beyond his current ability. Purity was an obvious weakness, but it would not work as well against Ra as it did his minions. Pure divine energy, ironically, seemed to be a weakness as well. Besides that, Lex also looked out for its strengths. Lex was sure that Ra knew that his minions could never hope to defeat him, but he sent them forth, anyway. Perhaps he wanted to use the black sludge coming out of their bodies to poison him somehow, or maybe they were just a part of a greater setup. If Lex could determine the deity's plan beforehand, he could work against it. Unfortunately, he could learn nothing of note. That left him only one option, to defeat Ra before he could pull whatever trick he had in mind. Just as Lex had that thought, the array he was building was completed. A beam of intense white light shot out towards Ra. The deity, although occupied with Fenrir, had enough awareness to dodge the beam. He even turned and showed a smug face. But it was pointless. The beam was never an attack. The moment it reached the other corner of the room, it exploded, not in an earth-shaking or massive explosion. Instead, it painted the entire area in a white, shining glow, leaving the entire place without a single shadow. The minions groaned even more, and the various spatters of black goo that had filled the battlefield began to evaporate. This was a simple precaution Lex took to turn the battlefield in his own favor. Ra's smug grin turned into a grimace, but he seemed to no longer want to wait. He twisted his finger and began channeling a massive stream of corrupted divine energy. Lex had no experience in blocking the flow of this kind of energy, so he decided to raise the pressure while he did so. With a flaming sword and endless soul attacks from his eyes, Lex launched himself at Ra. Though he did not expect to hurt him much, or at all, through these attacks, he attacked as if the very next hit would slay Ra. Fenrir, too, did not slow down his onslaught. If anything, the two formed a strange synergy between them where they were not only attacking in tandem, but the timing and position of each assault was perfectly coordinated. When Lex went high, Fenrir went low. When Lex came from the left, Fenrir came from the right. Moreover, they seemed to make each other stronger as well. The fluid space did not seem to affect him at all, but when the intense gravity hit, Ra screamed in agony. Even his corrupted divine energy lost control, and started to lash around the hall as if it were a whip instead of a stream of energy. Noticing its effectiveness, Lex put away his sword and punched the deity again, but with his other hand. Injured and affected by gravity, Ra was unable to dodge the fist that landed directly on its face. Yet the lack of pain from the hit did not bring it pleasure, for it knew what came next. Space warped around his face, and the deity's entire body trembled in pain. He could not scream, for even the sound seemed pulled in by gravity. Its eyes submerged into its skull and its peak deformed. A reason-engulfing rage filled Ra as he let go of everything and just focused on killing Lex. His technique finally came into effect, or at least some technique. The room around them morphed, and the rubble began to rearrange itself, assembling a stage and a throne. Hands made of solid stone emerged from the ground and grabbed Lex and Fenrir, trying to pull the two into the solid stone beneath them. New corrupted beasts began to emerge from within the platform, as if it contained an endless number of mutilated souls for Ra to use, and use them, he did. Like a drip, the souls from the stage merged into Ra, and the corruption around him deepened. Propelled by some invisible force, Ra floated into the air, past their reach, and towards the throne. Lex tried to stop him, but the numerous desperate hands emerging from the ground gripped him too tightly. Even if he was able to break one hand, dozens more caught on and wouldn't let him go. They were not a threat, but they could slow him down drastically, something he severely wanted to avoid. But it was too late for that. Ra landed on his throne and fixed his gaze on Lex. Chapter 926 Judgment. With Ra's gaze fixed on Lex, a pressure fell on the room and everything became still. This pressure was not like that of divine aura or dragon's might, which Lex could overcome through sheer force of will and determination. The entire room froze still under its effect, including Fenrir and the hands as well. The only thing still working was Lex's mind. He could not even drive his energy at the moment. Lex did not panic, but he was cognizant of the fact that he was stuck in a tricky situation. If Ra were so powerful, he could instantly freeze them all to begin with, and then there would have been no reason to put up with their previous farce. But he hadn't, and even tolerated the humiliation of being attacked by Lex and Fenrir at the same time. He even suffered many wounds from Fenrir, though for some reason he attributed the hatred from that to Lex as well. The point was, Ra's ego would not allow him to tolerate such a thing unless it was absolutely necessary. The only explanation was that this was a part of his technique, and the reason why Cassandra had specifically taught him to disrupt divine techniques. But she had not taught him how to effectively disrupt corrupted divinity, which is what he faced. This was either just another thing she hid from him, or the temple had no way for him to train with corrupted divinity. At least she had taught him all the traits of corrupted divinity, so he wasn't caught unaware. "You insufferable cockroach," Ra's voice boomed, though he was not yelling frustratedly anymore. "Your crimes are numerous, and for that I sentence you to an eternity of suffering." Lex observed everything with his left eye and saw massive amounts of energy begin to flow as soon as Ra spoke. Just as he suspected, this was some kind of technique. As if he were not the one being judged, Lex calmly but quickly reviewed everything he knew about deities. Whether they are fallen or not, the nature of a deity's power is dependent on their beliefs. If they want to expand their list of abilities, they need to either incorporate that into their belief or steal the domain of another deity, which naturally will add that both to their belief and their abilities. As if completely incensed by Lex's dismissal of his situation, Ra leaned forward to glare at him as he hurried up, filling the pit with lava. He was looking forward to seeing Lex scream and plead as the lava burnt him. This was, of course, not ordinary lava, but a special kind that directly burned the soul instead of the body. Yet Lex seemed to completely ignore the lava even as it inched closer. Ra sneered at his attempts to put up a brave front, but even as the lava finally touched his feet and began to surround his body, Lex did not even flinch. Sure that he was just resisting the inevitable, Ra leaned even further in anticipation of his inevitable cries. But they never came. Lex, meanwhile, was curious about why Ra constantly kept forgetting about Fenrir. Was that the pup's new ability? The butter knife fully imbued, Lex's eyes flashed as he began his retaliation. He swiped the knife at the many hands holding him down, cutting through them like a hot knife through butter. Free from his restraints, Lex bolted, not away from the lava, but inside of it. His eye had already located the weak point of this technique, and he was going to stab it. Contrary to what he had expected, this lava was actually hot, and it did burn him. But the extent of the burns was completely negligible for Lex right now. Ra, stunned in disbelief at what he was seeing, nearly dropped its jaw or its lower beak. But since his focus was completely fixed on Lex, he seemed to have once again forgotten about the existence of Fenrir. He did not even notice when the pup broke out of his restraints, and was reminded of it only when he once again felt teeth sink into his neck. Chapter 927 Guilt Trip. This time, Fenrir had learned his lesson. Although Ra's body may seem like it was solid, it was actually just a shell made entirely from corrupted divinity. Hidden somewhere within the shell was the ceremonial item that kept his clone active. So unlike last time, when it bit Ra's neck with the intention of cutting through his vitals, this time Fenrir gripped tightly, and injected its own energy deep within Ra's body. The force from Fenrir's tackle pushed them off the throne, and suddenly his ability deactivated. Lex, who was about to cut through the weak point of the technique with his knife, suddenly found himself back in the hall. "What the hell are you?" Ra's voice roared as his body disintegrated and reappeared behind Fenrir. Every time the pup attacked him, Ra was reminded of him, but every time he focused on Lex, he seemed to forget about this wolf pup. But having suffered numerous attacks, he no longer avoided Fenrir in favor of punishing Lex. "It's time to end this," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The odd forgetfulness he was experiencing caused him to raise his guard as he detected some kind of hidden danger. He still did not know where he was, and if there were any more enemies waiting for him. As much as it wanted to feel the satisfaction of watching Lex suffer, it was safer to just kill him. Ra reactivated his ability, once again summoning his throne as well as the stage where he could judge Lex and Fenrir. Corrupted divine energy rose in the air like a tidal wave, ready to swallow the stage as Ra retreated to the throne. New hands jutted from the ground ready to grab Lex and Fenrir once more, preventing them from following Ra. But repeating the same trick would not work now that Lex knew what it entailed. Long before Ra could get anywhere near the throne, Lex, ignoring the hands around him, blinked directly over. He had the butter knife in his hand, which was slowly and consistently damaging the corrupted divinity just by being in contact with it, but the speed was slow. The mask around his face, instead, was not damaging the divinity, but somehow protecting Lex from some of its effects, though he couldn't tell what they were. Ultimately, he was trapped and the pressure on his body was gradually increasing. Even with his strength, it would only be a couple of minutes before he started to get crushed. Sensing that his current situation was a lot more dire than anything Ra had put him through so far, Lex tried some drastic measures, but none of them seemed to work. He even tried activating space unraveling in an attempt to break this tomb that way, but every time he got close to activating the technique, Lex would become extremely dizzy and lose control of his energy. He needed to come up with a quick way to escape this tomb. If he began cultivating his body would slowly adapt to this corrupted divinity, that would take hours, time that he did not have. What could he? "You know, you never really checked up on Big Ben after you brought him to the inn," whispered a voice in Lex's ear. "Sure, you sent him and his wife to the hospital. But they lost their unborn child, and you never even check up on them. Forget being a decent boss, are you even a decent human being?" Lex froze, startled not only by the voice, but by what it had said as well. What it said was not true, he had made sure that they were alive and well. "Oh yeah, you checked through your system. But did you ever go meet them? Personally? But isn't that just who you are? Didn't you do the same with Harry? You dropped by once and dash." Lex snorted and began ignoring the voices in his head. Trying to guilt-trip him? He had seen enough anime to know that trick like the back of his hand. He resumed his efforts to escape. Chapter 928 Diversion. In essence, there were a lot of things Lex hadn't done perfectly, or even well. But he knew that his intentions were always good, and that he was always trying to improve. If, despite that, he messed up somehow, he'd just learn from that mistake. As long as he was alive, he could do something to make up for it. With a mentality like that, it was difficult for Lex to get pulled into feelings of guilt and shame, especially during a situation like the one he was in. Perhaps there was more to the technique and his mask was blocking out key factors which would result in him falling victim to it. But while the effectiveness of the technique dropped, it didn't change the fact that Lex was slowly getting crushed to death. Lex tried a number of different things, from his various techniques, to teleporting away by first creating a barrier between himself and the tomb, but none of them seemed to work. Either the tomb could tolerate the damage from his techniques, or his techniques would fail to execute. The voices in his head were also getting louder, so that even if he was not affected by them, he was certainly distracted by them. Lex entered his overdrive state to consider possible solutions to his situation, and suddenly something clicked. He recalled a moment during his training when Cassandra mentioned that his mask seemed inherently predisposed to enticing negative emotions. Although the comment seemed harmless, it triggered an idea. He used his spirit sense to guide the corrupted divinity around him towards his mask and tried to imbue the mask with it. At first, the mask seemed to resist, but eventually, it began absorbing the energy. When that moment came, it was as if a floodgate had been broken, and the corrupted divine energy flowed into a mask like a torrent. The moment his fist touched R.A., Lex activated space warp, once again distorting the deity's body. But he already knew hurting Ra's body was futile, so the purpose of that attack was not to injure him, but to disrupt the deity's control over his own energy. Without missing a beat, Lex summoned dozens of imperial shields around them both, enhanced by his spatial affinity, therefore blocking R.A. from teleporting out. Then, he began absorbing the freed-up corrupted divine energy into his mask, while at the same time he used space unraveling within their enclosed space. Considering the state of Ra's body, Lex would take more of a beating, but as long as Ra's energy control continued to be disrupted, his objective would be met. "Why are you so annoying?" R.A. roared, right before his beak evaporated under the influence of the dissolving space. "Chaos energy? Are you crazy?" Ra's voice echoed in their trapped space, despite the fact that he no longer had a mouth. Lex could originally only use this technique for a couple of seconds, but considering that he was recharging his energy actively, the duration was extended by a few seconds more. Those few, hard-won seconds were not spent in peace, as not only was Lex himself having his body burnt through, but he had to dodge Ra's attacks while maintaining every other action he was doing. But the flow state ensured that Lex's concentration was never broken, regardless of the condition of his body. "Your ceremonial item is not hiding inside your body," Lex suddenly exclaimed. Ra's body was a diversion, the item was somewhere else to begin with. Lex instantly dismissed the shields, stopped space unraveling, and blinked away. Broken, battered, and missing an eye, Lex suddenly started sweeping the area for Ra's core as he suddenly started getting a very bad feeling. This entire fight had been a diversion. Chapter 929 Finally. Fenrir, his body is just a diversion, Lex stated through his spirit sense. Instead of attacking him, look for the item. No matter what, RA would definitely interfere with their search. After all, if the deity had gone through so much pain and effort just to distract them, he was either plotting something sinister or was incredibly weak at the moment. Regardless of whichever one it was, they could not afford to wait. The only thing in their favor at the moment was the fact that the item itself was probably not so far from them. After all, it had to maintain its control over the body made from energy, as well as its numerous techniques. Between the two of them, Fenrir was more likely to succeed because he could somehow make RA forget about him. Lex's plan was to search for the item, but most attract Ra's attention while he searched, so Fenrir could investigate freely. Come back here. RA roared, having realized that his ploy had been seen through. While Lex looked severely injured, RA was not any better, either. His body could continuously heal using the corrupted divine energy, but the more of it he used, the less he had in reserve. That meant Ra's body was continuously decreasing in size. By now, after its previous vicious beating, its body was barely larger than Lex's. Lex, of course, had no interest in obeying RA, so the miniature deity chased after him. But a game of tag with someone who could use blink was bound to yield no results. Using his left eye and spirit sense, Lex scanned his surroundings before teleporting away. The first thing he investigated was the strange metal pipe RA had been holding. He had appeared to be siphoning energy away from it, but Lex dared not overlook anything. But it was too obvious, and there was no sign of any ceremonial item nearby. He teleported again and again, overturning even random rubble on the floor lest the item be hidden underneath. I don't know, so why don't you tell me, Lex said, stabbing RA again in his puny back. It's a karmic law. Do you understand? A law. The Innkeeper's attack has become a part of the Origin Realm's law, and will target me for all eternity. RA reached a point where he could no longer take it. He had been somewhat pretending to lose his anger to keep Lex occupied, but now he really was losing his anger. Ever since he fell, he lost control of his emotions more and more easily. It made it difficult to get anything done. But right now, RA no longer even cared. In his eyes, all that mattered right now was killing Lex. He even discarded his original plan, just to kill him. RA clenched his fists, summoning forth a massive amount of corrupted divine energy, nearly destabilizing his body's structure. He was waiting for Lex to stab him, and then his body would explode. It would be a waste, but it was impossible to survive a divinity explosion and remain uninjured. RA did not let on he was waiting, and made it seem like he was casting a technique. Just as he expected, the sensation of sharpness finally arrived. But the baby Ra's expression changed. He was all too familiar with this feeling. It wasn't the knife, but the teeth of an accursed wolf. Moreover, he wasn't biting his neck this time but. RA opened his mouth to scream, but his already destabilized body dispersed. Lex blinked over to Fenrir and found him biting an eagle feather. Fortunately, he had not crushed it yet. Chapter 930 Angry Student. Don't break it, Lex instructed as he looked up at the giant wolf. Even if he were in his usual size, he would find Fenrir massive right now, let alone in his baby state. Lex leaned against one of Fenrir's legs and summoned one of his many immortal-level missiles, letting it sit amongst the rubble. Letting out a sigh, he gently sat on top of it, nearly wincing as he sat. Why was it that pain was so much easier to ignore in a fight, but as soon as it was over, it was almost unignorable? The pup, similarly wounded, shrunk his size down and lay his head in Lex's lap, though he never loosened his teeth at all. He needed only to increase his force by a fraction, and his teeth would tear through the feather. His instincts were practically begging him to do so. But since Lex had asked to wait, he would wait. Their blood slowly dripped from their bodies and fell onto the missile. A few drops had to accumulate before they began to slide down that as well. Lex observed the feather with his left eye, trying to understand how RA had used it. For a very long time, Lex had been looking for ways to make clones of himself. How cool would that be? But every technique he discovered came with massive drawbacks. It was never worth it. He wondered if Ra's technique was any better. He really liked the idea that this temple was the perfect place for him to secretly train his employees, but he could not send them to the temple if there was any doubt about it at all. Given your young age, I just thought you were just naive, Cassandra said casually. Most people who lack experience more or less believe whatever they hear. People with experience often drop their guard after experiencing some benefits, and begin to doubt their own original suspicions instead. I'm glad to see you're not so foolish. Let's talk a bit, but first, let me take care of this. She waved her hand, and an imperceptibly thin shield appeared around the missile, isolating it from the rest of them. Even Lex could not detect the shield, but he could tell that he had lost contact with the missile. She also summoned the projection of a chair and a table, before taking a seat. Cups and plates appeared on the table, filled with various foods. Cassandra only grabbed what looked like a teacup and took a sip before continuing. Help yourself to something if you need it. I feel like this is going to be a long talk. Let's begin with your fight with the little bird. Your performance was not bad. Clearly you have been hiding the extent of your skill, as you performed a lot better than projected. You also got a little lucky, because you inadvertently protected yourself from the deity's schemes. Instead of giving you all the answers, let's do a question and answer session, to see how much you picked up. Do you know what the deity's goal was? Lex got up from his missile and stepped up to the table. But instead of pulling out a chair, he summoned another missile and took a seat. Cassandra was not the only one who could make a silent statement. Cassandra clicked her tongue and isolated the new missile again. These things weren't toys to be left around like that. This student of hers really had a temper. He was definitely planning something, otherwise he would not have used an energy body to distract me for so long. But we figured it out in time and prevented his plan. Wrong, that's not what happened, Cassandra corrected. Chapter 931 Possession. Before Cassandra could explain what she meant, Lex summoned another missile. This time, he did not sit on it. Instead, he summoned an imperial shield behind him on which he could lean back, and placed his legs on the third missile. Of course, by the time Lex placed his feet on it, Cassandra had already isolated it again. It was more than clear that Lex was extremely dissatisfied with the way he had been manipulated. But instead of being frustrated, Cassandra found his little tantrum amusing. She, of course, knew that his true age was not that of his body. She estimated that he was, at best, a few decades older, though so to her he still really was a child. The fact that he was showing his dissatisfaction, and complaining, even if his form of complaint was to threaten the temple with a missile containing a heavenly immortal attack, meant that their relation was not pushed to the point of no return. Cassandra did not allow the appearance of the missile to pause her explanation. The assessment you have given me is the one you formed while you were fighting RA. If you take a minute to think back, and look at everything that you know now, you may reach a different conclusion. But allow me to skip over your introspection, and bring the correct conclusion directly to your attention. From the very first moment you fought the deity, his intention had not been to kill you, regardless of whatever you may think. After all, the gravest injuries you have on your body were all caused by yourself. Cassandra paused to see Lex's reaction, but he sat completely unashamed. Blood was dripping down his face from the massive hole where he used to have a right eye, but it had mostly stopped. Even if he did not seek healing from her, within a couple of weeks he'd be back to brand new based on his own regenerative abilities. If Lex looked at things more critically, even back then on that planet where RA first appeared, capturing him had been easy, too easy. Lex had assumed it was due to being underestimated, and had subsequently used Ra's body to absorb divine energy. He used his own cultivation technique to improve his body using divine energy. Back then, he felt like he was taking advantage of RA. But, if the same scene was looked at with a different lens, wasn't Lex altering his body and thereby making it the perfect vessel for RA to possess later on? He got chills as he reached such a conclusion. He may feel like he had escaped Ra's clutches already, but what if that was also part of his plan? What if he was lowering Lex's guard, and would find a way to possess him at some other point later on? Lex frowned as his thoughts reached this point, but then he calmed himself down. He was not exactly helpless, and even if a deity wanted to possess him it was not so easy. Even if he ignored all his other numerous benefits, just Dragon's might alone would protect him from that. Then there were his bonds, as well as the system, the sword inside his soul, and so many other things. He suddenly imagined his soul like a bar where numerous powerful people, entities, and phenomena gathered to have a drink. Pushing away the random thoughts, he turned to look back at Cassandra. "That's not exactly helping your case, you know," he said, still waiting for the explanation for why she had lied. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 932 Lost My Trust. "I genuinely could not have anticipated that the intention of the deity was to possess you," Cassandra explained. "Under normal circumstances, there would be not much to gain, and plenty to lose. But, regardless, due to his intentions, and your many, overwhelming advantages, your encounter with the deity fell short of my expectations. It was quite disappointing actually." She stated her feelings, quite freely, as if uncaring that they might further aggravate Lex. But she didn't keep him stewing either. She quickly continued to the next part, which contained her reasonings. "As you correctly guessed, it's not a big deal for me, or even Mateo, to deal with the intruder. Outside the temple, we have no authority. Inside, nothing can happen that we don't allow." She paused to look at Lex in the eyes, and then towards the missiles. "Nothing," she repeated as if to emphasize the point. But instead of getting the message she was trying to convey, Lex just summoned another missile. He was rich and outlandish, what could they do about it? Cassandra sighed and nearly rubbed her head. Despite her endless patience, she had never worked with a baby before. It was a novel experience. The plan was Mateo's, but when he informed me of it, I agreed wholeheartedly. Regardless of anything else you may or may not believe, there should be no room for you to doubt that the purpose of the temple of fasting is to train humans. It is to help them overcome difficult personal trials, hence the name fasting. Cassandra Vans Agnew, Lex said, as he sat up straight and looked her in the eyes, when you first appeared, you asked my permission before becoming my teacher. I do not know much about you, but if I take things at your word, then you are one of the strongest humans ever. For someone of your level to show any attention towards me at all should be my honor, let alone asking me for my permission. I realize that. I am grateful, for your training has helped, and honored that someone of your level would pay attention to me. But, Cassandra, I am neither your subordinate, nor your subject. I did not come to you asking for training, nor have I asked you particularly for anything. Do you know what that means? It means that while I appreciate your guidance and help, I am not willing to be manipulated, even if you think it is for my own good, or lied to. I am not willing to compromise on certain things, and I do not owe your temple anything, regardless of your intentions. I only came here to take Z back with me, and you are the ones who delayed it. Now I cannot help but think what kind of torture or mistreatment you put him through in the name of training him. What are the lengths you are willing to go to fulfill your role, despite the will and interest of the person involved? What gives you the right to decide for me or mine what is good or bad? Lex could not hide the aggression in his voice, or in his eyes, but he ultimately calmed himself down. Things had not gotten to the point of no return yet, and it was true that he was in their territory. It was not good to push things too far. The gist of the matter is, I no longer trust you, so how can you regain my trust? If you cannot, then please take me to Z so we can leave you and your temple to continue to hide from your enemies. We won't continue intruding. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 933 Realm War. Not a flicker of emotion appeared on Cassandra's neutral face as she heard Lex complain. Should she say he was too privileged? Or that his backing was so strong that he couldn't appreciate the opportunities he had been given? Faster than Lex could process, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her forehead. How long had she been asleep so that golden core cultivators could just ignore her guidance? Had the realms really progressed that much? She found it hard to believe. She got up from her chair and paced around, all of this still happening with such a small frame of time that Lex would not be able to tell anything happened at all. For a moment she considered if she was truly in the wrong. But then just concluded that Lex's situation was unique, which is why he had the option to not tolerate such methods of training. He could afford it. Was it worth it for her then to humor him? She thought for some time, but then concluded his potential was too great to waste. She sat back down, and slowed down her perception of time back to a normal level. Lex was staring at her, as if waiting for her to give him an explanation. Truly dealing with babies was a hassle. How had she ever dealt with her own? The truth of the matter is, you do still trust the temple. You trust it in your gut, even if you don't want to, even if you don't understand why, said Cassandra as she poured herself another tea. Unfortunately, she was right. Lex could feel it in his gut, in his very soul. The temple would near harm him, and he could trust him. That feeling came from his core, but the feeling did not bind his actions. Since he did not understand it, he could choose to ignore it, something he was very much contemplating. But the problem is, you don't understand the context of that feeling. You don't understand the purpose of the temple. You don't understand why the temple would even suffer losses, and it has very much suffered losses due to the actions of that deity, just to train you. I can explain it to you, so that you understand. But first, I want to understand you a bit more. It will help with my explanation. The answer is, it does not matter. What matters is how many mature realms there are in the universe. That is a much more finite number, compared to the total number of realms. More importantly, what matters is why there is a difference between mature and non-mature realms. You see, child, everything in existence has a life cycle. The life cycle of our universe is right at the start. Our universe is young, you can say. And like all things young, the universe is growing. That growth allows new realms to be formed, and for them to mature. The origin realm is an example of a realm that is about to mature. Now Lex, can you tell me what the most valuable resource in the universe is? Mature realms? Lex guessed, based on the theme of her explanation. It makes sense that you would think that, but no. The most valuable resource is time, and it's running out. You see, the universe is approaching the end of its youth or early life phase. Once that happens, the universe will reach an equilibrium. That means the number of mature realms will be fixed, and all other realms, which have not reached full maturity, will be stuck at the level they've reached. Now why is this important? I'm going to gloss over a lot of things and get to the point. Technically, you're still too young and low-level to learn about such things. Heavenly Immortal Realm would be the ideal realm to get in contact with this stuff, so I'll be brief. Although time is running out, that is only on a universal scale. In practice, it means there are billions of years left for this phase to finish. But this phase will not be spent in peace. The most valuable thing about mature realms is their ability to support high-level cultivators and nurture them. You see, once the level of a cultivator reaches a certain point, they no longer need mundane resources. Instead, they need a deeper comprehension and mastery of laws. For Tao Lord to grow, entering new realms that have not yet matured, but are nearing maturity, is the most ideal experience. They can feel the new laws being formed, which allows them to gain a deeper understanding of the Tao. As for cultivation realms higher, well, it's best if you don't learn about it yet, trust me. But as a result, all mature realms, and realms nearing maturity have been embroiled in a war. Different factions want control over realms that are maturing so that their Tao Lords can grow before the universe's growth period ends, because after that it will become exponentially more difficult. Not all realms have the same rate of time flow either, so realms in which time passes more slowly are exceptionally valuable. Now that you understand this much, you should also understand that control over mature realms provides massive benefits to a race. Have you heard of the cosmic ascendance spectrum? If a race gains control over a mature realm, then the benefits of that are felt by every member of that race across the entire universe. Which is why those who control important realms don't want to give up control, and those who don't have control want to take it. The human race is also very much embroiled in this war, and in fact very recently lost control over a majority of the realms they controlled, even if they were not mature ones. The temple, though it is in hiding for the moment, is very much a strategic resource designed to nurture generations of warriors for the realm war. But due to certain losses, the temple was hidden. There are forces out in the universe acting to bring the temple back, but there are also forces doing their best to ensure it doesn't come back. There are too many things that I cannot tell you right now, but I hope you understand. The temple is for the benefit of all humans across the entire universe. Chapter 934 Enlighten. Baby Lex felt contemplative as he heard Cassandra's explanation. He had learned a lot of new information that was more relevant to him than she knew, all in the hopes of explaining something that she never said explicitly. The understanding was that in the fight to control already established mature realms, or maybe gain control of realms nearing maturity, so that the Tao Lords of each race can grow, the temple of fasting trained warriors who would go and fight in that war. Or, maybe, the purpose of the temple was to produce Tao Lords to take advantage of the situation? The progress of this realm could literally affect humans across the universe by giving them a higher position on the cosmic ascendance spectrum. This benefit was far greater than it seemed, and as someone who first-hand experienced it, Lex could testify to this. He had managed to raise his personal level, through various means, and it allowed him better control and perception of spiritual energy. He also believed that it allowed him to do more with the same level of affinity than someone lower on the list would be able to do. So basically, the purpose of this temple was extremely altruistic if they just wanted to help humans, extremely cruel if they just wanted to pump out cannon fodder, or, most likely, somewhere in between. What Lex was wondering now, his thoughts already diverted from if he could trust Cassandra, was if his new, upcoming realm would be influenced by this war. Technically, it shouldn't, since it would be a new realm, and nowhere near maturity. He needed to know more about this realm war. So basically you want me to trust you because your purpose is to train soldiers to die in some war, he asked, pretending to still be skeptical. Am I really going to be influenced by the temple's aura? Am I going to be forced to participate in the realm war? Cassandra snorted. Goodness no. The temple has karmic protection. You will not be influenced by its karma, aura, or anything of the like at all. As for whether or not you will get pulled into the war, I cannot say. The temple most certainly won't send you off to the war, but your background seems special. How do you know you won't one day get pulled into it anyway? You need to know, the stronger you are, the harder it is for you to avoid such things. Whether you want to or not, you get pulled into camps. For example, regardless of your background, as far as the war is concerned, you're already a part of the humanoid camp. That includes all races that are humanoid in nature, such as devils, celestials, elves, dwarfs, gnomes, fairies, angels, and more. You'll notice how, individually, these races do not seem to have aligned interests. Devils and angels, especially, are notorious for their animosities against one another. But, as far as the realm war is concerned, they are all in the same camp, whether they like it or not. The lines are already drawn, the camp's already made. Too many higher powers are invested in this, and the stakes are too high, so all anyone else can do is try to get every advantage they can. The temple is one of those advantages, saved for a time when the humans are doing slightly better. If it comes out now, it will easily be destroyed, and the loss will be monumental, even greater than the loss of some of the smaller realms. It was surprising to know that humans and devils were in the same camp. In the origin realm, humans were used by devils to farm the production of demons. That did not seem like the action of an ally. To be clear, the laws of each realm were not the same. What might be a fundamental rule in one realm, for example gravity, may not exist at all in another realm. Time was the only constant in all realms, and even then, the flow of time was not exactly fixed across realms. So when a new realm was born, it was a time wherein its laws were being created. For a Tao Lord, that was even more valuable than experiencing the maturing process of a realm, because at that time they can literally manipulate the laws themselves and the abundant energy of the new realm will automatically fix any mistakes they made. But it was almost impossible to learn of the location of a realm before it was born. Even the highest powers could not divine it, because they were protected by the laws of the universe itself. A certain gleam couldn't help pass through Cassandra's eyes. If your organization can get access to a newborn realm, is that really something you should be worrying about? Even if there is a realm war, your level is too low to get involved. But since you asked, I'll tell you anyway. The involvement of your organization in the realm war may or may not happen, but it definitely won't be because of a new realm. However, they most certainly will have a war on their hands if they are unable to keep their realm's location a secret. However, I doubt that's something you have to worry about, and is something that has already been prepared for. Lex rolled his eyes internally. He was the one who would have to do all the preparations, which meant that there were none in place at the moment. The chances the system would help him were about 50-50 as well. Just as Lex was beginning to consider the precautions he would need to take, Cassandra broke his train of thoughts. Lex, do you know how many human Tao Lords there are in the universe? Not many, I'm guessing, he answered slowly. It did not take a genius to tell that Cassandra's interest in his organization had been piqued. He could not help but wonder if that was a good thing. I can't say for certain how many there are, but the official number is 0. There are 0 human Tao Lords that are publicly known, she said slowly. There's always a chance that there are some who are just keeping themselves secret, but, honestly, that is very unlikely. Do you know why? I'm guessing you are about to enlighten me, said Lex. Cassandra smiled at him, not at all peeved by his attitude. Lex felt a little embarrassed. He did not mean to sound irritated or cocky, but it was not exactly easy to have a casual conversation while suffering from countless holes in your body. It hurt. Yes, allow me to enlighten you. Chapter 935 For Profit. It's very simple, Lex, Cassandra said as she sipped her tea. humans are not bottom of the barrel. There are trillions, or races below us, not to mention the microscopic realms and all the living entities they contain. But having many races below us does not necessarily make us powerful either. Even when a human reaches the peak of celestial, they are unable to cross that barrier and become a Tao Lord. After a very detailed and extensive investigation into why, carried out by multiple races that do have recognized Tao Lords, it was concluded that humans cannot comprehend the Tao as well as other races. For them to reach the same level, they would need many times more opportunities than their peers of other races. Cassandra paused for a moment, as she seemed lost in thought. Lex, on the other hand, was enjoying the crash course that he was getting right up until he felt a strange pressure on his chest. He could not move, he could not breathe, he was pretty sure even his blood stopped pumping. Oddly, though, it didn't hurt. It didn't even alarm him. Cassandra waved her hand, and Lex seemed to forget something, and the pressure vanished. "Yeah, I saw that coming," she said as she looked at Lex apologetically. "For your own safety, Lex, I cannot say too much. But, basically, the human race really needs a boost in their cosmic ascendance spectrum ranking. We've suffered innumerable losses in the war, and if it continues, and we lose our protection, they may even fall from their current ranking. If we dash." "What the hell was that?" Lex asked suddenly, only after he escaped the effects of the pressure on his chest. He had been dying, but he could not react to it at all. "That was the reason you should not learn too much before becoming stronger. The universe was assimilating you. I have protected you for now, by removing the information and its associated consequences from your mind. Do not think about it. Do not ask questions about it. In fact, as a rule of thumb, you should avoid all secrets relating to any beings heavenly immortal and above, just to be safe." Lex rubbed his eyes as he tried to get his mind around what had just happened. This innkeeping business was going to get harder and harder. He was going to keep it closed for a few centuries, at least. He just needed to figure out if that could, in any way, keep his new realm hidden as well. "Lex, I'm going to be upfront with you. I want to talk to one of your superiors. If I can visit a newborn realm, even briefly, it will drastically improve my chances of becoming a Tao Lord. It will be a huge boon for humankind, but I won't try to guilt you using the fate of humanity. I'm sure we can come to an agreement." Lex was not surprised by her request. He more or less expected it. In fact, a part of him even wanted it, which is why he had mentioned everything so openly. I don't know what you mean by that, but the Inn does not usually participate in external events. We keep to ourselves, and just host the guests who come to us. I will have to discuss the details with the innkeeper. Even if he has a human affiliation, I cannot reveal the location of the temple. You can keep the temple safe. The workers can come here directly without the need for the temple to reveal itself. Besides, having a worker come over and bringing the innkeeper's business card is the only way you'll be able to speak with him. Cassandra narrowed her eyes as she thought about what Lex said. The innkeeper could somehow access the temple even as it was? Was it because of Lex and Z being here? Did that create a risk in their security somehow? She synchronized her authority with the temple, but she did not feel any instructions to move, or perceive any incoming threats. Interesting. In that case, I don't mind. I was going to have you deal with the curse, and another matter as a part of your training as well. But since you want to deal with things more straightforwardly, I'll just skip it. Excellent. But I need to see Z first. I have to make sure he is alright before I call anyone else to the temple. Sure. Mateo will take you to him now, though, do not disturb him. He is undergoing a very delicate inheritance process. It will be a great loss if he misses this opportunity because of external disturbance. Also, leave the deity's feather here. I'll return it to you, but there is something I need to do first. Mateo reappeared, ready to lead Lex to Z. With their immediate actions decided, Lex left the feather behind and followed Mateo. Cassandra did not move even after he left, her gaze fixed on the feather for a long time. Will you reveal yourself, or shall I purge you? She asked, her voice a lot more sinister than when she was speaking to Lex. Instead of Ra, the deity, another being emerged from the feather, though this being had no physical body. It was the living manifestation of laws which had destroyed BGY 987 with its very existence. In front of Cassandra, it looked like an awkward child who knew they had done something wrong. Chapter 936, Totally Not a Villain. Cassandra was in a conundrum. This little guy in front of her was an absurd mutation and would be extremely valuable to her if she was anywhere near the Downlord realm. But she wasn't, and even her suppression over it depended on using the temple's help. She could not allow it to run free and could not use it herself, and because she was stuck in the temple, could not sell it either. Maybe she could use it in her bargain with the innkeeper, but that was yet to be seen. Sleep, she said, her voice filled with echoes of power. The figure attempted to resist, but ultimately could not. The temple was special in that way. The fact that it was used to train humans was a front. Its real value came from the fact that it was essentially a controllable self-contained realm, with all its laws at the whim of its controller. It was in hiding for so many more reasons than just the realm war, but she could neither speak of it or even think of it. But, while she was within the temple, at least she could make use of the limited authority that had been shared with her. She turned her attention to the feather that contained the wisp of the deity's consciousness. From what she recalled, he had some kind of issue with the innkeeper. Peeking into his memories might help her figure out what kind of organization the Midnight Inn really was. Her eyes began to glow, and the feather seemed to whimper. Lex was laying on Fenrir's head as they followed Mateo. Instead of heading directly to Z, they were first going to a rejuvenation room, which would allow both of them to heal. Considering the nature of the attacks that caused the wounds to begin with, Mateo recommended they avoid healing via divinity. I thought my plan was really good, Mateo said after a very long, awkward silence. In truth, Mateo was the only one feeling awkward. The other two were in too much pain to focus on anything besides. It was a good, moral motivator for growth. According to the temple's scans, your disposition is leaning towards good, with only a few strands of chaotic tendencies in it. Considering that Z, your partner, will not wake up for many more months if everything goes well, I thought it was a good use of time. Lex raised an eyebrow. Was Mateo feeling guilty for how he confronted Cassandra? Well, she did say that the original plan was his. Considering how much effort they put into training and guiding him, he guessed it would be mean to leave him feeling as such. It is a much more versatile version of the ability in your left eye, and its possibilities are endless. It can allow you to learn techniques faster, grow your realm faster, become the best oracle in your realm. Most importantly, it makes up for one of the fundamental weaknesses of humans, which is that they have trouble studying laws to begin with. That in itself is what prevents them from growing their realms once they reach immortality. Lex was silent for a time. If he understood Mateo correctly, his flow and other states were a result of his bloodline? It made sense. The tangible benefits he received from each state had to be coming from somewhere, and he had not seen other humans do it, so it wasn't as if it was just a human thing. But his bloodline was so powerful, his ancestor William must be pretty great as well, to have created such an ability. Yet, he was weaker than Jotun. For some reason, Lex did not care as much as he thought he would. It was just an interesting little tidbit of information to him. Can you tell me more about the inheritance Z is getting? What's so special about it? I recall the first time you told me about it. You said he was undergoing an evolution, not getting an inheritance. It is more or less the same thing. Your companion was detected to be the descendant of a very prestigious human bloodline, long thought to have gone extinct. In fact, it is a little strange, because the bloodline he has is not even the one he should have gotten from his ancestor, but that is also explainable. A more recent ancestor's ability will override a more ancient one. While his bloodline cannot be changed or altered in any way, the dominating traits of his original ancestry are being awakened. You are probably aware that humans too have many subraces, right? For example, the Nico or Draco subrace types. Well, his original race type is being stimulated, which is why I said he is undergoing an evolution. But such a change cannot happen overnight, and will progress over many decades. For now, the stimulation is already done. What's left is to arm him with the knowledge that comes with his race, as well as some of his original ancestors' heritage. Trust me, this will not harm him in any way. This is probably the best possible path of growth for him that exists. Lex did not respond immediately. Instead, his mind wondered a few different things. He knew that his workers were all clones, and in fact he could genetically modify them quite a bit, to the point of even choosing their bloodlines. In that case, chances were that Z was actually a clone of this so-called descendant. What interested him more was the fact that Mateo claimed his line was supposed to have ended. So how did the system have access to it? Was there another cloning system out there, with countless DNA strands from countless races, just waiting to be used? Or was the owner of that system using them for their own purposes? The oddly sinister nature of this entire thing was the reason Lex distrusted systems so much. Then again, he was the one who kept buying more workers, so he couldn't really complain. Was that immoral? Should he stop? After a moment of pondering, Lex decided the more moral thing to do was get his own hands on the cloning system, so he knew for a fact that it wasn't being misused. Unlike him, who did his best to provide his workers with the best life possible. Yes, Lex totally wasn't a villain. Chapter 937 Overwhelmed. The healing process this time was nowhere nearly as quick as what Lex experienced previously, but at least he was numb to the pain. At first, Lex spent some time conversing with Mateo, but the longer he spent wrapped in this leaf, the drowsier he got. Suspecting that sleep would shortly arrive, he practiced the technique to keep himself from divining anything, and then allowed himself to drift off. The gentle sounds of the water around him kept him company, lightly rocking the lily pad he was in, and allowed him to fall into an exceptionally deep sleep. By the time Lex woke up, he felt incredibly refreshed and ready to seize the day, but the leaf had not unwrapped itself. He considered whether he was supposed to open it on his own, but fortunately reached out and asked Mateo first. Apparently, he was feeling great not because his body had finished healing, but because the leaf had subdued all his pain. The healing process was taking longer this time because the effects of corrupted divine energy were not so easily removed, and to avoid any hidden injuries, they were being extremely thorough. Lex could have gone back to sleep, but instead he decided to cultivate instead. He had decided to break through to the nascent realm when the new realm was born, taking advantage of all the rare and potent energies available at the time. For that, he would need to be at the peak of the golden core realm, and make sure he was in the best condition to move up. Lex had expected that by cultivating now he may pick up some immunity to corrupted divinity, but instead, his technique started adapting to the lily pads. It started to mimic their conditions as well as its effect and began absorbing them. But if Lex wanted to completely replicate the effects, he would need to spend months in this environment, but he was satisfied, as is. He could also feel the growth of his golden core. Growth was an ironic word to use, since the size of his core shrunk the higher his realm went. He could tell that soon, it would be no bigger than a piece of marble. Cultivating was, by far, one of the most addictive feelings, and Lex did not miss any opportunity to spend some time doing it. Unfortunately, the healing session was completed before he could reach his limit, so he had to stop prematurely. Now, I'll bring you to the observation room. From there, you will be able to sense, see, and even communicate with him. However, I strongly recommend that you only observe and do not distract him. Lex had received similar warnings enough times to understand that Mateo and even Cassandra highly valued whatever change Z was going through. Lex did not promise anything, however. He would judge for himself Z's condition before deciding whether to interrupt the process or not. This would be the last determining factor in whether Lex decided to trust the temple or not. Not ignoring his many warnings, Lex disabled the peculiar vision of his left eye, and withdrew his spirit sense as he waited for the wall to transition. But before the wall changed, a number of formations were activated around the chairs, creating a soft barrier. The formations seemed like they were designed to protect the seated from something. Now Lex was taking the situation even more seriously. He activated domination, and instead of spreading it, simply coated his body with it, creating a sort of armor using only aura. The room underwent a few more changes, though besides a nice-smelling incense and some kind of purification, Lex could not determine what they were, before finally the wall Lex was faced towards began to change. It seemed to become an open window, peering into a massive marble hall. Lex saw nothing else, for he had to close his eyes as a result of feeling sensory overload. It was not painful, but it was reminiscent of the way one would usually turn down the volume in the car while driving through heavy traffic. One's brain could focus only on so much. Somehow, just being exposed to the air in that room was overwhelming his brain. Listening to the sound of silence in it was nearly driving him crazy. To have his eyes open and actually look at the hall would have rendered him unconscious. He felt the surrounding formation vibrate as it negated the effects of the hall, and slowly he felt the pressure on himself reduce. He entered his overdrive state and peeked his eye that he barely opened. Just that small peek which allowed him to only see the mixed shades of white in the marble floor threatened to overwhelm him again, and so he paused, to allow the formation to activate once more. The formation vibrated even more fiercely, signaling that it was approaching the limit of its ability. This unusual oppression was such a strange experience that Lex almost considered beginning to cultivate here. But first he had to sate his curiosity. Without opening his eye any wider, he carefully looked around the hall. Finding Z was easy. He sat cross-legged with his eyes closed, and appeared long before Lex saw any of the statues. For a time, Lex observed him closely. He tried to check if he was suffering in any way, or had suffered any harm. But from the look of things, he was fine. Lex frowned. Visuals could be deceiving. He was not satisfied with just seeing him be fine externally. If Lex was suffering so even while being so thoroughly protected, he could not imagine what Z must be experiencing. He had to somehow learn more. Chapter 938 Inheritance. Before attempting to delve deeper with his investigations, Lex first inspected Z's visible condition. He did not appear to be suffering from any kind of pressure, and instead appeared to be lost deep within his meditations. His brow and jaw were relaxed and not clenched or scrunched, which indicated how at ease he was. His hair had grown longer, covering his ears, and early signs of facial hair were showing, which was another sign that he seemed to be doing fine. He was wearing a loose robe, which had clearly been given to him by the temple, but on his feet he wore a familiar pair of bathroom slippers. Lex felt somewhat relieved upon spotting the slippers, as they may be helping him tolerate the pressure. But the slippers only ignored passive, environmental damage or pressure, so he was not completely sure if they would activate. After a long while of observing every little detail, from hair luster to fingernail length, Lex was not able to detect any physical anomaly. As far as he could tell, Z was in a healthy state. But how could he check Z's mental state? Well, technically, due to mind meld, Lex had a way. But he would need to, at the very least, touch Z with his spirit sense first. Even ignoring the repeated warnings he'd gotten not to disturb Z, getting his spirit sense to Z without first himself being overwhelmed by the pressure was going to be a difficult task. Before making any drastic decisions, Lex decided to finish observing the room first. The room was surprisingly bare, compared to the rest of the temple. But a room filled with so much pressure likely did not need decor to build its ambience. With eyes nearly squeezed shut, Lex inspected the remainder of the hall, little by little. The first time one of the statues entered his vision, Lex needed to pause. The formation around him could increase its effects no longer, and even entering overdrive state to boost his brain hardly helped. But, eventually, Lex found a way. If he took a considerably long time, and only looked at the statue little by little, his brain would be able to eventually handle all the pressure it was being exerted to. It was a tedious process, but Lex was dedicated. It took him around 2 hours to eventually see the first statue in its full glory. This routine continued for nearly 10 days until Lex finally saw all 24 statues in the room, besides the one in the center. Of all the statues, the only one whose appearance Lex was able to observe was the one Z was in front of. It looked remarkably similar to the teenager, only a little more mature. It was not surprising considering he had been informed that Z was his descendant, but he could not help but hope Z was only receiving an inheritance instead of being used to reincarnate his ancestor. It was a diabolical thought, and he had no reason to suspect such a thing. But Lex was not naive. It was an entirely possible scenario, given how much they valued the ancestor. Today, he was completely fresh, so he was finally going to attempt observing the last statue. After one last glance at Z, he turned his attention to the middle of the room. He could not avoid the trepidation that filled his heart. It felt as if it was coming from his very soul. He inched his vision closer and closer, and the nearer he got, the greater the feeling of fear that had taken a hold of him. Just as Lex was about to glance at the lowest point of the statue, his instincts began screaming at him. Looking up any further was a very bad idea. Normally Lex was fearless, but after almost being absorbed by the universe just because he listened to some information regarding celestials, he gained a healthy amount of fear and respect for things relating to higher levels. Eventually, he relented. He did not take a look at the statue, and instead returned his focus on Z. After looking at the rest of the statues, the amount of pressure he faced had dropped, so he felt like he could attempt using his spirit sense now. It was a slow and excruciating process, but eventually Lex touched Z with his spirit sense. He did not nudge the teenager, or distract him in any way. Instead, he used mind meld to turn a wisp of his spirit sense into thought and infiltrated Z's mind. What Lex saw was a war. It was a war that spanned the entirety of the primal realm, the first ever realm in the universe. He saw only glimpses of it. He saw humans fighting behemoths. He saw deities being crushed under the feet of giants. He saw a horde of beasts pulverized by a single creature. He saw the ascension of dragons for killing a creature that in itself was akin to the sun and the moon and the sky. He saw the invincible phoenix, burning again and again until it became fire itself, and forcefully took on death and made it its own dominion. He saw death and destiny as two living beings, still young and feeble. He saw more, so much more. "You are impressive, child," a gentle, loving voice spoke directly into Lex's mind. "This is not your inheritance, but I will allow you to take a piece of it nonetheless. But it will be locked in your mind until you prove yourself worthy. Unfortunately, the battle is lost. Now, life is but a play, and the living are merely performers. Perform well, and you will be rewarded, and gain a chance to learn greater secrets. I'll give you a hint. The cosmic ascendance spectrum is merely one of many rankings. Get your name on one, and you will gain the qualifications to become a true performer. You will forget this as well, but a part of this knowledge will stay with you. Whether you want to ignore it or prove yourself will be a decision your subconscious mind will make, based on who you are. But I have a feeling that I will see you soon." Chapter 939, Sense of Community. The images Lex saw all faded from his memories, and were instead replaced by memories of various basic weapons. When he saw the spear, his mind stayed calm, as was the case with the bow, the dagger, the dart, and hundreds of variations of these weapons. He even saw some swords, but they were all kinds that Lex had never used before, or could not reconcile with the way he used swords. But eventually, an image of the kind of sword Lex normally used, which he identified as a standard double-sided sword, and Lex's mind had some fluctuations. As if responding to his fluctuations, Lex continued to have visions of a war, though for some reason the details always eluded him. Instead, what Lex retained was the experience of using the sword. He used it as a mortal, as a cultivator, as a soldier, and a bandit, and in countless other scenarios. He became accustomed to it, so much so that not having a sword felt strange and incomplete. But after each wave of visions, the memories would drain away from his mind, leaving behind only traces of their presence. This continued for many cycles before Lex began to see other weapon shapes. The next one that resonated with him was the Buster sword, mainly because of his experience wielding the 8-feet-long sword while being a baby. He had more visions about that, and then forgot again, once again leaving behind only traces. Then the process repeated. The next time, Lex resonated with the butter knife. After that, he resonated barehanded combat. Then with arrays. Then with techniques shot out from one's eyes. The process was extremely thorough, and seemed to last forever while he went through it, but each time the memories would fade, so he only remembered a few moments passing. When the visions finally ended, and Lex woke up, he found himself meditating in the observation room. The window to the room where Z was sitting had already faded, and the wall had resumed its normal condition. Besides feeling a slight mental fatigue, Lex felt more or less normal. He got up from his chair as the door opened to reveal a perpetually anxious Mateo. "You were in the room for 5 days this time. Cassandra won't be happy that you missed so many meals." Shaking his head, Lex said, "It couldn't be helped. I think I received a part of an inheritance." Mateo trembled, and Cassandra also suddenly appeared beside him, her eyes fixed on Lex. "What do you mean you think?" she asked. A small percentage of the guests who remained were representatives of powers who had hidden items of great value at the inn, such as the paladins. Then there were the guests who used the beyond the grave feature of the inn to exist as spirits. Finally, the last portion was a random mix of guests who had various reasons to stay behind. This included the many guests still breaking through their realm from the last time the inn underwent a star rank increase. It would not be unusual if they stayed that way for a few more years, as cultivation at higher stages often became such a lengthy process. This, of course, excluded the many guests who had leased minor realms from the inn, as even those had become locked when the inn stopped accepting guests. Anyone could still enter those minor realms, but they would not be able to return to the inn. As a result, compared to the past, where the inn was a hotbed of activity, things were calmer and more peaceful. The few guests living at the inn had developed a sort of community as well, and arranged for some activities amongst themselves. The book reading club had become considerably famous, and the founder of the club, Gladius, became one of the most well-known guests at the inn. The club extended to many members who were not at the inn as well, via the Henali portal. But the integral members all stayed at the inn. Many of the regulars were trapped outside since they could not afford to stay at the inn perpetual, much to their regret. Regardless, Gladius had no intentions of leaving, and had started to include many of Velma's followers into his club by doing readings of her comics. Things at the inn felt incredibly harmonious, and even those guests who weren't exactly social and did not like to interact with others began enjoying the environment. It was much better than the previous, extremely hectic and crowded inn. Many of them wished that things would not change. One of the guests, an old nascent realm cultivator who had no hope of ever progressing further, had even deposited enough MP to book a room for the next 100 years. He would probably die before that, but he wanted to spend his last days in peace, at the inn. Such an environment left many of the workers with a lot of free time. With not much else to do, they often enjoyed some of the inn's amenities and services themselves, using the MP they got in their salaries. But today, suddenly, almost 95% of all inn workers were suddenly asked to assemble without explanation. They gathered in the village, which was the only place to hold such large numbers. Over 100,000 workers gathered, which was quite a sight. Most of the time they were spread out across the inn, so it was difficult to realize how many of them there were. But considering that the inn frequently handled guests in the millions, this was a very small number of guests. Gerard, the only person with a following of admirers that was even remotely close to that of Velma's, walked out on stage in front of the massive crowd. After returning from the war he, and many others, had broken through the Golden Core realm. As a result, his appearance was refined once again, and although he retained a look of maturity, all of his wrinkles disappeared. As the head of security, he was well known by all, not to mention that he was one of the first 2 followers of the Innkeeper. Although Luther was supposed to be the Innkeeper's assistant, more of the workers were familiar with Gerard. After all, Luther spent most of his free time training. He had no social life, to speak of. I hope you all are well, Gerard said, his voice as comforting and smooth as always. I won't mince words, mostly because we have urgent orders. All of you have been selected for a great opportunity. The few who will be left behind will bear the responsibility of continuing to run the inn, but they will still get the same opportunity, but later. But alongside an opportunity, I feel this is a responsibility. I hope you all will put in your best effort not to disappoint the innkeeper. Chapter 940 Secrets of the Void. A wave of excitement traveled through the crowd as they heard Gerard's words. It had been a long time since the innkeeper gave them an order, and though they were enjoying the quiet environment at the inn, they would rather feel productive. Once the Midnight Battalion had returned, and stories of what they experienced spread out among the other works, through Velma's comics of course, many of them felt horrible for not being able to help them. It was never their fault, of course, since the number for the battalion was limited. But nevertheless it had a massive effect on the entire staff. I have received word from Mary that the innkeeper will be sending us to a secret location, Gerard continued, looking out at the endless sea of workers. Not all of them were summoned by the system, and included people like Harry and Charles, who were equally invested. You are not allowed to share the details of that location with anyone, and it's best if you don't even mention it, even to each other, unless you are in secure areas where only workers are allowed. Intrigue and curiosity spread amongst the crowd, but even Gerard did not know the details. Now everyone get ready as we'll be teleporting over shortly. Getting ready did not really require them to do anything, since the teleportations from the inn were always seamless. It was more of a mental preparation for the actual event. Lex, who had been watching the entire process through the system, covered all the workers with his authority and chose to teleport them over to the temple. 149,984 workers teleported to the inn all at once, appearing in a massive hall. Lex had no control over where they actually appeared in the temple once they got here, but did not think it should be an issue either way. Fortunately, the entire group was teleported over together. He did not really need to inform Cassandra and Matteo when the teleportation was complete, as he saw their expressions change as soon as it happened. He was well aware of the skepticism they maintained about his claim of being able to bring his co-workers to the temple, since the temple was supposed to be in hiding. Lex touched the orb and upon parsing through, jumped to his seat and buckled himself in, allowing Cassandra to lead the way. He had expected that the orb would travel within the temple, but was stunned when the orb, with him and Cassandra as well, moved through the walls as if they were a mirage, and began following a trail on the outside. Lex was stunned by the sight, as he was for the first time able to observe the enormous size of the temple, protected from the crushing influence of the void by the orb. But the orb was moving fast, and Lex could not get a detailed view of the temple, so he turned his attention to the void instead. His limited exposure to the void behind space had been very turbulent, so he had no real impression of it. Now that he could finally look at it, he was surprised to learn that it wasn't filled with darkness. No, instead a strange, flowing energy filled the void, giving off a faint light that was constantly changing colors. The energy, visible due to the light it gave off, seemed to be traveling in thin streams and filled nearly the entire void, making it a mesmerizing spectacle when one didn't have to protect themselves from it. In the distance, though it was difficult to judge exactly how far since the concept of location and distance were inherently connected to space, Lex could see void dwellers, swimming through the energy. Lex had fought not just a few of them, but it only occurred to him now that considering how dangerous the void was, the dwellers he faced were not so powerful. It didn't make sense. How did they even survive the crushing pressure of the void if just his attacks were enough to kill them? He asked Cassandra, and received a surprisingly simple explanation. Void dwellers are incredibly powerful, only so long as they remain in the void. Over here, they could have peak nascent level, or even immortal level strength, but be reduced to the foundation level once they leave it. That's because their biology makes them dependent on the energy from the void. The energy actively fuels their strength. Because of the abundance of this particular void energy, void dwellers do not have any way of storing it in their bodies, as they do not need it. But as a result, as soon as they leave the void they are deprived of their strength and become exceptionally weak. Despite their loss of power, however, all void dwellers try to leave the void any chance they get. It's difficult to know the exact reason. There are many theories about it, but studies and research have revealed unexpected and confusing results. If you try to read the memories of a void dweller, you will see that they only recognize the void as their eternal prison. But no one has ever been able to find any proof of them being imprisoned here by anyone. All signs indicate them being born naturally in this environment. Even the void dwellers themselves don't seem to remember who imprisoned them or why, just that they want to leave, even if they suffer a massive drop in power because of it. Lex was intrigued, and wondered what secrets lay awaited to be discovered out in the void. The universe was filled with such secrets, and the Midnight Inn allowed him to get in touch with them and explore them, which is why he really liked it. But he could not get rid of his suspicions at the same time. Continuing to exist like this was not viable. He had some ideas on what he could do to remedy the situation, but all of that would have to wait. For now, he admired the incredible view, and promised himself that if he ever became powerful enough, he would try to uncover the secrets of the void, and the void dwellers.